Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the second webinar in a series dedicated to demystifying wildlife crossing infrastructure projects. We'll get started today right away after a short video.
Wildlife vehicle collisions cause roughly 200 human deaths and 30,000 injuries in the United States each year, costing drivers more than $8 billion annually. In America, a car strikes and kills a large animal roughly every 26 seconds. Roads create barriers to wildlife as they seek food, water, and mates, and as they attempt to adapt to our changing climate. Fortunately, proven solutions exist. Properly sited crossing structures with associated fencing along roads can reduce these collisions by up to 97%. Late last year, Congress passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act with bipartisan support, which expanded federal funding opportunities for wildlife infrastructure, including $350 million in brand new dedicated funding for a wildlife crossing pilot program. Our organizations are working to raise stakeholder awareness about wildlife crossings, how important good data is for investing in and prioritizing crossings, and helping applicants identify potential funding opportunities within the new infrastructure law. On behalf of our organizations, we thank you for your interest in furthering this crucial work to make our nation's roadways safer for both people and wildlife.
Good afternoon. My name is Marta Brocchi. I'm the Associate Director of ARC Solutions. ARC has partnered with Wildlands Network, the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, and the National Parks Conservation Association to deliver this webinar series dedicated to demystifying wildlife crossing infrastructure projects. Our next webinar on tackling the #1 barrier to wildlife crossings, looking at funding opportunities within the bipartisan infrastructure law, will be held on June 9th at noon Eastern Time. The registration link for the webinar is in the chat box, and an invitation to register for this event will be sent to everyone who has joined the webinar today. Thank you for joining us for the second webinar in this series. Today's event, You Can't Fix What You Can't Measure, looks at the fundamental role of data and partnerships in successful crossing projects. We're joined by our expert panelists today, who all have diverse and valuable expertise in studying and implementing wildlife crossing projects. Liz Fairbank, road ecologist with the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, will kick us off today with a presentation on data collection methods and tools. Then Liz Hillard, senior wildlife biologist with Wildlands Network, will discuss data analyses that inform wildlife crossing structure placement for both human safety, connectivity, and wildlife movement. Jeff Hunter, senior program manager at the National Parks Conservation Association, will be speaking about the NGO public outreach part of the puzzle, illustrated by the I-40 Safe Passage Project. And finally, we're joined by Jens Hilke, conservation planner at Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, who will speak about best practices for coordinating among state agencies, NGOs, and other interested stakeholders that underlie successful public-private partnerships. At the conclusion of the presentations, my colleague, Kylie Paul, road ecologist at the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, will be moderating our questions and answers portion. We hope to have about 15 minutes at the end for questions to be answered by our panelists. So please feel free to submit any questions that you may have for our panelists as we go along. And also please upvote any submitted questions that you would like to see answered. To our audience members, thank you again for being here to learn about this important issue. And with that, I will turn it over to Liz Fairbank.
Awesome, thank you, Marta. Let me start sharing my screen here. Okay. So like Marta said, I'm going to be talking about data collection and data needs for identifying and prioritizing locations for wildlife crossings and monitoring their effectiveness. So when we're talking about wildlife vehicle conflict and mitigating that, we really have two main goals, and that's to improve human safety and reduce road mortality by reducing wildlife vehicle collisions, and then maintaining or improving habitat connectivity for wildlife. And as we heard in the first part of this webinar series, really the most effective way to reach both of these goals is by installing grade-separated wildlife crossings, overpasses, or underpasses, combined with fencing. But we also know that these are expensive, they're a big investment. So how do we identify and prioritize the best locations and also ensure that what we do is effective in meeting our goals? We need data. So what types of data should be collected and when? So there's really kind of two main buckets of wildlife vehicle conflict data, and that's on wildlife vehicle collisions and then habitat and wildlife movement. So it's critical to have this data throughout the process when you're identifying and prioritizing locations for crossings, identifying your target species, and designing the appropriate type of structure in terms of the type of structure, the dimensions, what the approaches look like, making sure that they're appropriate for the target species. Same thing with fencing. How much fencing do you need? Where should it start and end? And then once we actually build these structures, how do we monitor use and effectiveness to make sure that we are doing adaptive management, making sure they're as effective as possible, and also to inform future projects and best management practices. So in this first bucket of wildlife vehicle collision data, one data set that we have available to us is crash data. And this is typically collected by law enforcement. And it's consistently collected, but it typically only includes reported crashes. And so, there's lots of reasons why people might not report a crash, particularly if it's doesn't have a lot of property damage associated with it. So these are usually crashes that have significant property damage. Again, these are crashes that get reported. So people who have full coverage insurance are obviously more likely to report the crash. The data fields that are collected are inconsistent. So sometimes it might just say large wildlife, or it might say livestock, but you might not get a species associated with it. And the data that we do have is skewed towards common large ungulates. Most of this data is deer, and it really only captures a fraction of wildlife vehicle collisions and excludes typically small animals and more rare species. So the next type of wildlife vehicle collision data that's available in some places is carcass data. And this is typically collected by maintenance crews. Not all states collect carcass data, and there's no standardized methodology for doing this. So search and reporting effort varies pretty drastically. This can be from state to state or between maintenance districts or even just different roads. And it's opportunistic. So typically, this is only done on state maintained routes. The spatial accuracy varies. So sometimes you might see carcasses reported just to the nearest mile marker or 1/10 of a mile. Other times you might actually get a GPS coordinate associated with it. So it's hard to pool this data and actually use it to prioritize crossing locations. And again, it's really only capturing a small fraction of wildlife vehicle collisions and typically doesn't include smaller or more rare species. So in some cases, if you live in a state where carcass data is not collected, or if you're interested in especially smaller or more rare species, you may need to do more targeted systematic surveys to really get the full picture. And I'll talk about a tool for doing that a little bit later. So the next type of data that you need to really know where the most important places to invest are is wildlife movement and habitat connectivity data. And there's a bunch of different types of data out there for this. GPS collar data of wildlife is obviously super helpful. So again, something that's not available everywhere, but you can see the picture on the bottom of this slide here is collar data from different ungulate species along I-80. And you can see the barrier effect that shows up when you actually can take a look at that. You can also talk to your local biologist, get expert knowledge about where wildlife are moving across the landscape. You can do highway monitoring with camera traps or sand tracking. You can also look at critical habitat for threatened and endangered species. Where do you have highways that are cutting through critical habitat? Habitat connectivity models like what you see on the right here. This is the California terrestrial habitat connectivity layer. And then you can also look at existing infrastructure and see what wildlife are using those. Are they effective crossings or not? And same thing for fish passage. So doing culvert assessment, seeing if Culverts are a barrier to fish passage, also really important. I know we mostly talk about terrestrial species in this, but let's not forget fish. So then there's other considerations. So when we're talking about investing in wildlife crossings, there's a lot of other things to consider. So you have kind of this human safety perspective, you have the habitat connectivity perspective. But if we're going to build structures that have a 75-year lifespan, there's other things to consider, like what's the land use? Is there secure habitat on either side of the crossing, and will it remain secure into the future? So either having public lands or having properties that have conservation easements on them is really important to make sure that we don't invest in a wildlife crossing in a location that might be subdivided 5 years down the road. Another thing is social tolerance. So do you have kind of landowner and community buy-in in the area that you're working? There's all kinds of engineering feasibility issues to consider, as well as cost benefit analysis. So once we have figured out where to invest in wildlife crossing infrastructure, it's also really important that we monitor for the use and effectiveness of those measures and see, are we meeting our goals? Did we make the right decision, pick the right type of structure? Is our fencing starting and ending in the right locations? So at minimum, you at least need data from before and after you do a mitigation treatment, but really the kind of gold standard for ecological study is the before after control impact model. So you have before data and after data, but you also have controls in space and time. So you have data collected at the sites that have been mitigated, and then you also have data being collected at unmitigated sites to compare what the actual impact of the treatment is. And again, we're looking at these two different types of data. So wildlife vehicle collision data, that crashing and carcass data that we talked about, and then wildlife movement data. And you can collect that through a variety of different methods using camera traps at structures, fence ends, and other structures like jump outs or wildlife guards at access roads. Again, just making sure that the designs are working, that the investment is effective. You can also, of course, use GPS collar data and things like sand tracking. And it's really important to monitor over time. What we found in a bunch of locations is that there's a learning curve. And so if you're only monitoring for 1 year after a structure is built, it might seem like it's not as effective. This chart on the right shows deer and black bear crossing data from Highway 93 in Montana. And you can see that the trend in use keeps going up over the course of the 5 years of post-construction monitoring. And we see a similar thing happening. This is over the course of 12 years of post-construction monitoring of the structures in Banff National Park. And you can see here for moose and grizzly bears, which can take a little bit longer to start becoming comfortable using these structures. If you only monitored for the first couple of years, you'd think, oh man, moose aren't really using these things. But over the course of time, they learn and they adapt to the structures, and you see that use continue to go up. So again, I talked about really the need for standard and spatially accurate data on wildlife vehicle collisions. This is not something that's done widely across the US. So a project was initiated a few years back. The National Park Service and US Fish and Wildlife Service partnered with Western Transportation Institute at Montana State University to develop a standardized wildlife vehicle collision data collection system for federal land management agencies. And now this tool is available to other agencies, organizations, tribes, and citizen scientists. And we're using this on projects all across the US. And this year, the roads project is in phase 4 and is actually going to be implemented across Department of Interior lands. So the roadkill observation and data system, ROADS, is hosted on Esri's Survey 123 app. So it's a commercially available platform that's already being used by lots of different agencies and organizations. It has standardized data fields, and you can collect data on both live and dead animals with or without cell service. It automatically formats the data into a spreadsheet and a map with GPS locations in real time. So no additional data processing required, no paper data sheets. And the observer can lock in the location and then move to a safer site to fill out the information about the location. You can take a picture, and it's a non-proprietary data form that partners can use and modify to collect similar data in other places. So with that, I think I'm going to end and pass it off to Liz Hillard.
Wonderful. Thank you, Liz.
Yeah.
Hopefully everything's, oh, didn't go through. Hopefully I'm looking good there.
Looks
Thumbs up.
great.
Okay, thanks. Hi, everyone. Glad to be joining you today. Liz did a great job of setting up the various methods and tools of data collection. Myself, Liz, will be giving a high-level overview of the types of data analysis that can be used for identification of wildlife crossing mitigation opportunities for both human safety and wildlife connectivity. A quick disclaimer before I get started. There is this whole other piece to data analysis where you're exploring and looking at the data and the information you've collected. The analysis and the information you can gain from the analysis really is only as good as the information you've collected. And so robust measures for data collection, like Liz have reviewed with the roads tool, allow for accurate collection and thus more insight. So in short, know the limitations of the data you have and be upfront and state those limitations as best you can. So here I've broken down typical data collection for road ecology projects that Liz also mentioned: wildlife vehicle collision locations to identify areas with human safety concerns, and animal activity and movement data. While robust wildlife vehicle collision data collection may allow you to infer that these wildlife vehicle collision hotspot locations are also important areas for wildlife to cross the roadway, you do need to incorporate wildlife specific data to ensure not only human safety increases, but that wildlife connectivity and movement is improved as well. So to jump in here, I'll be using the road ecology research project Wildlands Network has been co-leading with National Park Conservation Association as an example or model to help visualize the data breakdown. Jeff Hunter will be discussing the large collaborative effort surrounding the Pigeon River Gorge Connectivity Project in the following presentation. So I forgot to mention, I am mostly going to be focusing on data analysis for wildlife vehicle collision location data with some insights into how wildlife movement and activity data can be incorporated into projects as well. So here again, using this project in right outside of Great Smoky Mountains National Park, I'll try to set this up. So here we have Great Smoky Mountains National Park. We're in Western North Carolina, Eastern Tennessee. This boundary here is actually showing North Carolina and Tennessee. We have Great Smoky Mountain National Park, and we have Interstate 40. We also have important public lands, Pisgah National Forest, and then on the Tennessee side, it's Cherokee National Forest. As you can see, the roadway here would be disrupting wildlife movement to and from these important protected areas. And so this is just a little setup, again, just to give you an idea of the setup for this project. But getting back to, I will add too, because I do think it's important, that the focal species here are kind of our large charismatics. So here we're in one of the biodiverse regions of North America, a salamander hotspot, but we are really focusing on, we focused on bear, black bear, white-tailed deer, and elk for this project. One, because they're human safety concerns. Two, because they need large areas for their home ranges and to access resources. And three, they're also easier to detect as far as on the road for vehicle collision surveys, in cameras, and also to put GPS collars on. But getting back to the task at hand, we've identified our study area, and we're going to want to delineate that. So here I've identified our study area is this 28-mile section of Interstate 40. The next step is getting to breaking down the study area into segments. So we can have an identification and spatial reference for areas along the roadway. The length of segments, they can be specific to a particular study. I've seen lengths vary between 400 and 1600 meters. So dividing the roadway into these segments. So at the long end, about 1 meter long. But here in this map, it's a little bit to see the segments, but you see they're labeled there. These are 400-meter segments. And so for wildlife vehicle collision analysis, our goal is to identify where high incidences of wildlife vehicle collisions occur along the roadway. So these are often referred to as hotspots, and there are multiple methods to identify where these clusters of wildlife vehicle collisions are occurring. I won't detail all of those here, but in addition to identifying hotspot locations with robust wildlife vehicle collision data sets, you can do further analyses to incorporate how landscape characteristics such as topography and things like forest cover, and also road characteristics may be influencing where wildlife vehicle collisions along the roadway may be influencing why and where those are occurring. Again, as an example, along the 28-mile stretch of road we were studying in the Pigeon River Gorge, we ended up with 304 wildlife vehicle collision locations, both from law enforcement data, carcass information from state maintenance DOT folks, and also state wildlife agencies. And then really, we got those for almost 20 years, but in our 2.5 to 3 years of doing weekly driving surveys, we accounted for a lot of those locations as well. And so to understand, as you can see here in this map, I've laid out, spatially put out the locations of those vehicle collisions. And then, let me see if I have my, so what we simply did, I was mentioning there's multiple methods for hotspots, but in the Pigeon River Gorge, we simply tabulated the number of vehicle collisions per 400-meter road segment. And then we ranked those segments based on percentile ranks and identified hotspots as these segments that had 5 to 9 wildlife vehicle collisions. And we also incorporated some models to look at how road and landscape features may be influencing where these vehicle collisions are taking place. And so that's kind of identifying where we have, how we've ranked and broken down our vehicle collisions to get a better understanding and really kind of visualize where these are taking place on the landscape. And so we identified 22 hotspots or road segments with 5 to 9 wildlife vehicle collisions. And these hotspots were located in 10 general areas, 7 single hotspots, and 3 areas with multiple hotspots in continuous segments. And so the further analysis we did with the modeling, we also found that there was a higher probability of wildlife vehicle collisions near current bridges and culverts, and a higher probability of wildlife vehicle collisions where species preferred habitat exists. So wildlife vehicle collision analysis tells you where human safety is at risk, and it could also indicate that hotspots are also important crossing locations for wildlife. but robust data is really needed to evaluate that further. And again, bringing in, landscape and road features that may influence where these vehicle collisions are occurring may also help infer, like, are these important crossing locations? But the best practice is to incorporate wildlife information to improve connectivity and conservation. So like Liz was saying, the use of existing structures. So here we've got a cool picture of a bear coming out of a culvert. So we did in the Pigeon River Gorge monitor 21 structures, all that we thought were large enough sizes to at least move bears. And we identified crossings, positive crossings, both enters and exits from our target species in those locations throughout the landscape. And then also you can bring in animal GPS locations. And we also had 13 elk GPS collared. And we were able to use that information specific to those road segments we broke down to where elk are crossing, but not only where they're crossing, but where they're interacting with the roadway, but not crossing. And another piece to get at animal activity, though Liz mentioned a lot of different ways to get at activity, we did pair our road segments with wildlife cameras and came up with pretty generic measures of animal activity through detection rates and compared those to areas with wildlife vehicle collision counts. So all in all, we want to incorporate this wildlife information, and when in doubt, we have great information, foundational information out there about habitat suitability, about wildlife corridors, but also there's a lot of expert information on the ground and people that really understand some of these roadways that we might be doing higher level analyses on, but they're out there on the landscape. So I want to make sure to highlight, it's really important to get your folks on the ground's knowledge and understanding on what you're doing. So finally, in the end, we want to combine and present research findings. So essentially kind of what I was saying, ground truth with the local experts and what others have found in similar landscapes. Consider public land connectivity. Liz mentioned this, but of course, that's going to be something to consider when we're looking at these mitigation opportunities. Is there public land on both sides? Or is it protected land? Are there opportunities for protection? And then we want to share this information with our stakeholders and our collaborators and use this information that we've combined to identify locations for wildlife specific crossing structures, such as overpasses and underpasses, current structures for retrofitting, not ideal, but potential opportunities to help provide opportunities for wildlife to cross that already exist. And then of course, fencing needs. Fencing's an important part of this. So having the wildlife vehicle collision data with animal movement, because we need that fencing on the landscape to help guide animals to crossings opportunities, but also exclude animals from the roadway. So overall, we're talking about research, guided research to help identify a linked system of opportunities for wildlife to cross the roadway that'll increase human safety and wildlife connectivity. And that's going to be it for me. Thanks everyone for tuning in and for the organizers for the opportunity to present. My contact information and links to find out more about Wildlands Network are right here. And I'll be sending this over to my collaborator, Jeff Hunter.
Thank you so much, Liz. It's great to see you here sharing this space today with you. Okay. So Liz and Wildlands Network are really close partners with National Parks Conservation Association. And my name is Jeff Hunter. I'm a senior program manager with that organization based here in Western North Carolina. And while Liz was presenting, she was talking about our target species, but the first day she set foot in the gorge with me, we found a timber rattlesnake and 2 copperheads under the same metal speed limit sign. So there was adrenaline from day one, shall we say. There's a lot more critters in this space than just the big charismatic fauna. moment. Okay, so over the course of the last 5+ years, several dozen organizations have come together and have participated in the project that we're now calling Safe Passage. And this is the same project that Liz was just discussing. And here you see the logos of the primary federal, state, tribal, and non-governmental organizations who are working together in common cause to address what's seemingly an intractable problem. Lots of big animals and lots of smaller animals being hit on an interstate highway over a 28-mile stretch. I think the first thing to really factor in when you start bringing people together like this is that each one of these organizations has a different mission, different priorities, different decision-making processes, and sometimes different jargon. We just speak differently. And one perfect example of that is highway engineers and wildlife biologists. So you need to bridge that chasm at some point in time. It's taken time for us to work together. We're moving at the speed of trust. Prior to the pandemic, thankfully, we spent about 3 years meeting together annually, building those relationships. And so we were able to continue this project through COVID when we were meeting in a virtual space. Our mission together is to improve wildlife's ability to cross I-40 in the Pigeon River Gorge, which will result in improved public safety. And I think this photo is a perfect example to talk about partners. You know, when you're on this highway, whether you're checking cameras like Liz and my colleague Steve Goodman do, or just driving the corridor, you don't get the extent of the public lands that this highway threads through. So South Wings is a local nonprofit based here in Asheville, and their mission is conservation through aviation. And we've used them multiple times to get up in the air to try to understand this landscape from a different perspective. And in fact, I flew with them yesterday with an intern and a volunteer over the Interstate 26 corridor just north of I-40. Great partners. Here's that another map of our project area that I want to show you. So here's the Smokies, the Appalachian National Scenic Trail, the Pisgah National Forest. The stippled area is the Harmon-Den Bear Sanctuary, and this is the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee. What jumps off the page here is this is a multi-jurisdictional landscape. We're dealing with 2 DOTs, 2 wildlife agencies, each in North Carolina and Tennessee, 2 different parts of the Forest Service, the Cherokee and the Pisgah National Forest in different states, the National Park Service, and lots of NGOs. You need to bring these people together to the table. If you're missing 1 or 2 of these key folks, it's really hard to make progress and to work together. Before Liz was hired in 2017, we hired a consultant, Tony Clevenger. Some of you may know him. He works at the Western Transportation Institute. He's a road ecologist, and he got his master's degree at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, where he studied under Mike Pelton. He came down, gave a presentation to about 30 stakeholders in Maggie Valley, and then we went out into the field and took a look at some of the issues, some of the structures that we're dealing with. Tony made it clear to us that what we needed to do was we needed to gather data. We didn't have data. What we knew was anecdotal at the time. So within a year, Liz Hillard was hired at Wildlands Network. Steve Goodman was hired at National Parks Conservation Association, and they worked closely together to carry out this research in the gorge. In October of 2018, the Federal Highways Administration came down to Maggie Valley and offered us a 2-day wildlife crossing workshop. And we had 65 folks attend. Really important time for us for a number of reasons. Here you're looking at a breakout session around some maps. You have Dr. Joe Clark with the USGS, Dr. Chris Watson, who works for my organization, Tracy Davids with Defenders of Wildlife, a representative from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Lots of people coming together, sharing knowledge. It's really important to create that space and that time to have those important discussions and exchange information in a respectful way. I'll add that one important component in any meetings when you bring stakeholders together is meals. As a facilitator, I would always encourage people to eat with someone they don't know, to start to build those relationships. And in fact, now 4 years on from this last meeting, practically, there are a lot of tangential projects that have come on. Liz is working with different partners. My colleague Steve is working with different partners. Projects have cropped up as a result of the relationships that have been built from coming together. Our camera trap work is a really clear example of a partnership and people coming together. So Liz talked about the segments. We had lots of cameras used over the course of this period of time. We had 20 that were either stolen or vandalized. The North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission replaced each and every one of them. And that's because Steve and Liz were able to build a trust-based relationship with that agency. They want to see us succeed. We're partners moving together. There were permits required from different agencies. All sorts of different things happen in the background for us to be able to conduct this research over a 2-year period. And when we're talking about data, so Liz is compiling the data. We're looking at wildlife movement, but I don't want you to overlook the importance of the camera data and how you can engage the public and bring them along, explain to them the issues that are at stake. And here you see a black bear reacting. Capture this on our camera. It's an animated GIF to a 18-wheeler that passes just below. It really spells it out to people, and people start to understand the issues that are at stake. So that data can be utilized very much so for public outreach. Here's another great example. Just 4 days earlier, this bobcat and kitten tried to get through here together. The kitten could not find a way through. 4 days later, the kitten was able to successfully pass through here. And this series of photos just illustrates to folks point blank what's at stake and what the issue is. Bobcats are not a target species. We found they're quite common out on the landscape where we're working. And these pictures are just gold for us. So when we came together and started this research in 2019, 4 months in, the North Carolina Department of Transportation notified us that they would be replacing 5 bridges in our research area. And the scope of those projects was bridge replacement only. They could not allocate resources for wildlife enhancement. So NGOs came together, 7 of us, and said, if we raise money, will you work with us? And their answer was yes. So at that point, Safe Passage was born. We came together under an MOU. We worked with a marketer to brand ourselves. This is our logo. And then at that point in time, once we launched Safe Passage and asked the public to support, to join us, to provide resources to help mitigation at these bridge replacement locations, we were off to the races. And this information hit the news and it's like wildfire. People love this issue. I've worked on a lot of different conservation projects over the years. This is simply the most popular project I've ever worked on. I have rarely, if ever, encountered someone who says, this is not a good idea, right? People don't want to hit wildlife with their vehicles. The public can get behind this. And that data, the photographs, are just one really important piece to the puzzle. Here's a image that's found on our website, and I'll show you that URL on the next slide. This image was actually taken by Bridget Donaldson, who works for the Virginia Department of Transportation. But this situation pans out regularly in along I-40, just outside the boundaries of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Home, dinner, family time, all on the other side. This is marketed towards the audience of the general public so they can understand the issue. It's really important to break down the science and explain it in an accessible way when you're engaging with the media and with the general public. So this is our website, smokysafepassage.org. If you're bringing together a collaborative, you might want to look there and see how we have organized the information and convey to the public what the issue is. A big shout out to Ellie Wells, who's a marketer in Asheville, who helped design and build this website. And you can see folks can actually go to this website and donate. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that our partners at Wildlands Network are the fiscal sponsor for this project, and I'm grateful for that. There's one really interesting twist to this, and we have creative types who work with us, right? So Frances Feigert with Great Smoky Mountains Association is an editor and a writer, and she got an idea during the COVID pandemic to write a children's book, and she did it in short order. And now A Search for Safe Passages is published. It just won the Public Lands Alliance Publication of the Year just a couple of weeks ago. And it's really helping to reach out to children, their parents. It's actually a parable that is appropriate for all ages, although this children's book is focused on ages 7 to 13. It anthropomorphizes these animals, but in the back, there are species profiles of 20 different species we see on our cameras and information about road ecology projects. So a few lessons learned to wrap this up. I think it's important to lead with science. Research provides us with credibility. Utilize those consultants to bridge knowledge gaps like Tony Clevenger or Marcel Hauser, also with the Western Transportation Institute, and Terry McGuire, who worked with Parks Canada and worked in Banff National Park. He's been essential for us. Move at the space of trust. And as I said, those group meals can be really important. People sit down and open up when they're sharing a meal together. Use a facilitator or someone who can help you run effective meetings, both virtually and online. And bring your local land trusts in, particularly if you're dealing with a matrix of public-private lands. They're key, as was spelled out in our first presentation. And then, as I said, those relationships, they can just snowball, and you never know what's going to happen with these projects. We're on a journey here, and I'm just glad to be a part of it. So thank you for your time, for your attention to this issue, and I'm going to pass it over to Jens.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. I'll just share my screen. All right. I hope that's coming through. So yeah, thank you so much. I'm Jens Hilke, a conservation planner with Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. And I want to pick up more on the coordination and partnerships piece of this as we think about implementation. So, you know, in road ecology, of course, we're an interdisciplinary group to begin with because no one can do it all. And so we're pretty accustomed to the coordination between the science types who are identifying the locations, who then coordinate with the engineers to come up with the best designs, and then interact and coordinate with the policy folks for funding and permission and permitting and all of that. But beyond that, we need coordination for implementation to go beyond the pinch points of the structures into actual corridors and linkage areas that protect the connectivity and perpetuity. And so coordination with land protection interests like land trusts and state agencies, as well as land use planning and local engagement to make that all go. That type of coordination is a critical next step beyond the structures itself. So in Vermont, our coordination begins between our Agency of Transportation, I'll call them VTrans, and the Fish and Wildlife Department. And we've been working together for years. And many decades ago, before I started, that relationship was somewhat adversarial, you know, often in the regulatory arena. And over the years, we've worked to be much more proactive and really focus on that relationship. One of the ways we've done that is through the Highways and Habitats training that we've been running for at least 20 years now. And it's a training for AOT staff, as well as the Agency of Natural Resources staff and local road crews that focuses on road ecology. And we've turned that into a 3-tier opportunity to make it even more available to more and more staff, where that tier one offering is an online webinar and available to everyone. And then we have a tier 2 that's 3-day in person. And the tier 3 is really our varsity event designed for engineers to really get into the specifics. So the trust building, the relationship building that Jeff was talking about really begins here in these trainings outside of any sort of regulatory setting. The next step, I think, in coordination is getting people together. And this is a picture of our governor, Governor Phil Scott, visiting the Wolcott Wildlife Shelf Project. And you'll notice that that with him came many of the agency leadership, the Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources, the Secretary of the Agency of Transportation, NGO partners from the Nature Conservancy, staff from VTrans and Fish and Wildlife, as well as our local regional planning commission and others. So this focus on relationship building happens in the field, it happens in meetings, and yes, Jeff, I agree, it happens with food. So that piece of the coordination has really been important and happens at all levels of government and with NGOs and private partners. Another piece in our coordination efforts goes beyond government and our involvement in the Staying Connected initiative. That's a public-private partnership of more than 60 NGOs, all of the Fish and Wildlife departments on the US side within the region, all of the agencies of transportation, as well as ministries in Quebec, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. It's really a dynamic partnership that's focused on habitat connectivity across the entire Northern Appalachian Acadian ecoregion. So you can see here a map of our linkage areas. So these are not core forest. These are the connecting lands between core forest at this ecoregional scale. And that's the outer limit, the focus of this Staying Connected partnership that we've been working together on since 2009. Now, Staying Connected is organized at multiple scales, and I really want to focus on that. Again, the project level coordination is critical, but we're talking about a movement, really. So the coordination begins with the eco-regional level steering committee. So partners, both government and NGOs that operate at that multi-state international scale, gather together several times a year and have formed a steering committee. And that steering committee tends to take on more policy type coordination. Then in Vermont, and this is not an exhaustive list, forgive me, I've left out many partners here, but at Vermont, we have a state level Staying Connected partnership that I coordinate, and we meet 4 times a year and get all the players together. Then we also have linkage level coordination that allows us to bring in even more local partners. I want to flag that because some of the folks on this list may not have connectivity as a goal, for example. They may not think of themselves as partners in Staying Connected, and yet they're critically important for the implementation. And so they do attend the Staying Connected meetings and help coordinate at that most local level. So let me show you a little bit more about how the organization, the partnership is set up. So we begin with different buckets of partners that tend to self-align. And so conservation science partners, land protection partners, outreach partners, transportation partners, and land use planning. And so different partners will maybe fall into one of these buckets, or my organization actually falls into several of those buckets. And then we coordinate at the state team, at the state level. And so we have those 4 state Vermont meetings a year. But all of our linkages do this. And so they all coordinate across the buckets in each of the linkages. As I mentioned, there's the steering committee at the Northern Appalachian scale. And that helps coordinate all of the place-based linkage teams or the state teams across the entire Northern Apps region. We have an executive committee that helps run the meetings and keep us moving forward in between meetings, and a paid coordinator who really makes it all go. And that paid coordination is a critical piece of all of this. And we need that paid coordination over each of these levels, not just 1 year of funding, but multiple years of funding to make this go. I'll note that coordinator interacts at all levels of Staying Connected, with me as a state level coordinator and with partners on the ground. You can see that the policy and development and advocacy side of things will come into several of the different spheres. And you'll see that funding is necessary at each of these different scales. So my message here is that the scale of the partnership is really important, and different types of funding are needed at these different scales. Jeff spoke about the importance of relationship building, and that's a key part of the Staying Connected partnership. You see on screen a meeting of the Staying Connected leadership in 2019 in Orford, Quebec. Pre-pandemic, we meet annually and have been continuing that on Zoom. But really, those in-person meetings are incredibly important for trust building and moving the group forward. Now, I mentioned that multi-pronged approach, and I really want to underscore that. I think it's something that makes staying connected unique, and the coordination between the prongs, the buckets of staying connected is so critically important. Often in my work coordinating at the Vermont level, the lead in to one of these prongs is really more important sometimes than the substance, because it explains to all the partners why that prong is important, how that piece fits into the larger whole. And so that's critically important. Many of us in our own bucket don't necessarily understand what others are doing or why that's part of the larger connectivity picture. Of course, having getting all on the same page is critically important. And I talked about conservation science as the first step and one of the most important buckets. Here in Vermont, we use Vermont Conservation Design, and it's available to everyone on the BioFinder website. So that helps coordinate our partners. It helps work with land use planning interests at that local level. And it's really a critical first step in moving beyond a specific project into thinking about coordination at this linkage or statewide scale. We do work planning within each of our buckets and then as a partnership altogether. And so you can see some of the priority areas in each of the Vermont work plan items for science, land protection, land use planning, transportation, and outreach. And so that work planning and having that work planning at each of the different scales is important. Again, the scales are doing different types of work. I mentioned several times the importance of of in-person meetings and building that trust between individuals. That's one of the advantages of working in Vermont. We're so small, it is much easier to get to know people. But in addition, in Vermont, in addition to our 2 statewide meetings, we also have 2 place-based meetings each year, which allows us to focus on a very particular area and again, bring in those most local partners. I talked about outreach, and that really makes it all go. On screen are some examples from working in one linkage with our partners, Cold Hollow to Canada, and any of those buckets really benefit from that most local engagement. And I'll just wrap up by saying, the importance of a public-private partnership cannot be understated. As a state agency representative, I'll say that it's been really beneficial to us for expanding the capacity of our technical assistance and our land protection work, for expanding the spectrum of activity. For VTrans, it's going beyond the right-of-way. Having the different scales in the partnership is helping us with that eco-regional context and empowering local individuals. So with that, we do have time for questions. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks for sharing your expertise and your perspectives on all these great topics related to data and partnerships. So we've got a good slew of questions here, and I think we'll just kick off with asking the questions that have been posted. And so one question is from Trevor Kinley, and I thought perhaps Liz Fairbank could answer this question. And if others have ways to chime in as well, please, panelists, do so. His question relates basically to change over time. So it seems that, I'll read it. It seems that location selection is fundamentally different in landscapes where habitats are reasonably stable over time versus fire-driven ecosystems where conditions after construction are likely to be exactly the opposite of what they are during the planning phase. Any ideas on accounting for this in light of an infrastructure lifespan of perhaps 75 years? Liz, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, that's definitely a tough question. It's hard to plan for extreme weather events. One exciting thing that's happening now is the use of modular structures. So right now, the Western Transportation Institute is working on a fiber reinforced polymer bridge, the first of its kind for wildlife in the US. This is something that's been used in Europe for bike ped bridges and also for wildlife crossings. But with modular structures like these, it's something that you could actually pick up and put down somewhere else on new footings if the landscape were to drastically change over time and shift wildlife movements to a different area. So aside from that, in terms of actually planning for that, I don't know if others have different thoughts, but at least there are options in terms of being able to have these more modular type structures that you could potentially move.
Great. Others chiming in there? Okay, so let's see. Other questions. I'm seeing a couple. One was on the Q&A chat to us. One was in the chat proper. And they're both kind of asking questions about blending different types of data collection methods without creating duplicates. One is asking specifically if GPS technology is not available for assessing animal movement, is roadkill data and camera data the best combination to utilize when determining wildlife crossing locations? And then the other question was if using reported data, carcass data, and roads data for a hotspot map, have you determined a standard on how not to double the data count? And since not all wildlife vehicle collisions get reported, maybe the standard is to use all data for a given location. Liz Hillard, would you be able to answer some of that, those questions there?
Yeah, I'll answer those in reverse order. So with the last one, yeah, really important thing to bring up while incorporating data from multiple agencies for wildlife vehicle collision locations. I didn't necessarily find a standard, but I found a way to be really robust was to look at those locations, put a half a mile buffer along them, and any locations that were collected within the same 10 days in that half mile, I only used one of those locations. So trying to, reduce that potential redundancy of collecting data from multiple agencies. So did narrow down the information that way. So it's important, that needs to be considered and stated. And then if you don't have GPS location information on movement or activity, would pairing vehicle collision data with camera data be the best option? I would say it's an option, and I don't know what the best option is. That really is so dependent on so many things, capacity to check those cameras and things like that, or maybe you're in a landscape where it could be got at in an easier way. But also I want to mention, so cameras we subset the segments along the roadway and looked at animal activity and paired them that way. But also I don't want to take away from information that already exists within the state agencies, priority areas, conservation areas, important connectivity corridors. So hopefully that answers those two things.
Great, thanks. Jens, there's a couple questions related to staying connected. Does VTrans pay into this staying connected to fund the full-time coordinator position, and also which agencies or NGOs, governments might make up the executive committee?
Yeah, thank you. So funding for coordination has been a really tough ask. And so no, VTrans currently does not. The partnership is just moving to a membership, paying for membership model, and getting government to do that, to pay for annual subscriptions or annual memberships has been a big, tough ask. And so at current, no, they don't, but we're certainly working on getting governments to contribute. In terms of the executive committee, it will really, that's been run by the NGOs. And while I have served on there and other state, Chris Lazar from VTrans currently serves, really the Nature Conservancy has taken a huge lead in staffing and serves on the executive committee, but we have several NGO members on that executive committee in addition to VTrans.
Great, thanks so much. Marta, do we have extra time here, or are we looking to?
Let's take one more question and then I'll provide some closing remarks to wrap it up.
All right. we don't have a specific one. If anyone wants to, let's see, Jeff, have you seen what has been some of the barriers and tools to address those barriers? You did talk about best practices, but are there any specific barriers that you have seen to getting some of the work done?
Oh, that's an interesting question. There's so many moving parts. I think the barriers start to come down based on those relationships. I don't mean to be redundant, but it's so critically important. For instance, if we couldn't have replaced the 20 cameras that were either stolen or vandalized, that would have impacted our research study in a big way. So having a can-do attitude and just working together in good faith. Frankly, we're building a community of practice here in the East. In the East, we haven't done this stuff as much as you see in the Western United States and in Canada and Europe. So we're learning together, and those consultants are critical to fill those gaps. So it's exciting times here in North Carolina and Tennessee.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Kylie, for moderating the discussion. Thank you again to our panelists for sharing your time and expertise with us today. And thank you to everyone that joined for your thoughtful questions. For those that have questions that have not been answered, I believe Kylie put her email in the chat, so please feel free to reach out to her after the webinar. And as a reminder, for those of you that are interested in registering for our third webinar scheduled for June 9th on funding opportunities within the bipartisan infrastructure law, you'll be receiving an email invitation later today with registration information. So thank you for joining, and thank you to everyone who participated in this webinar, helping to demystify wildlife crossing infrastructure projects. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.